Welcome to the Sound Agents podcast. My name is John Campbell.
And my name's Moira Kenny.
The Curious Disappearance of Mr. Fu is one of a series of podcasts on the social history of Liverpool Chinatown. This story is based on 5 oral history interviews we recorded in 2013 with people whose families were affected by the forced deportation of Chinese seamen in 1946. We are standing outside the Old Blue Funnel Chinese shipping office in Nelson Street. During World War II, 20,000 Chinese seamen were based in Liverpool. Mr. Fu is played by Ozzie Hugh, and Kathleen Delaney is played by Moira Kenny.
My name's Kathleen Delaney. I was born and bred in Carl Gardens in the Dingle, not far from Chinatown. My dad came to Liverpool when he was 15 and he came from Southern Ireland. He came with his mum and his brothers and his sisters because his father was a merchant seaman, so he was expected to join him. You know, like everyone in Liverpool was really. My dad worked for the Liverpool Corporation and my mum was a housewife. She was half Irish, quarter Spanish, an eighth Scottish, an eighth Scandinavian. My family weren't practising Catholics. They had perfected it. We knew all the patron saints off by heart, and say if you lost a sock or your handbag, the whole family would get down on their knees and pray to St. Anthony. St. Anthony's great, because he's also the patron saint of lost people. My friend Brenda, she lived in Pitt Street, so I used to hang around there. Brenda was very cosmopolitan. She had it all. She knew exactly what she wanted in life. When we were at school, she had her sights on just working in a restaurant, just like a sister. Well, I wanted more than that. But she was all right to hang around with, you know, and she was always up for going out. She liked a laugh and we'd bunk into the Norwegian bar. You probably know it as the Nook. Brenda's family didn't like outsiders coming in. They still don't now. But I was all right because my Uncle Paddy lived in Frederick Street and he worked on the docks. And when you realise what was happening down at the docks then, you know, it was a hive of activity. And now what's happening, strikes for wages and stuff like that, it just makes you cry at times. It was a strong community in Chinatown and I liked that and I felt like I belonged. Carl Gardens was near the Southern Hospital. And when the gardens went up, it was considered to be built for the workers, people who could pay the rent. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was a fireman, so there were people like that in there, you know, policemen, you know, people who could pay the rent. Whenever I told people where I lived, they'd say, "Oh, that's a bit posh, isn't it?" But it depends on your definition of posh, doesn't it? I mean, the Queen Mother opened them. She thought they were horrible. She said that she wouldn't be seen dead in them. Listen to this. When I went round to Brenda's one night, there was this Chinese fella standing on the corner of the street. I think he'd just come off the boat. And he just kept looking at me. He was absolutely gorgeous, like Humphrey Bogart in the film In a Lonely Place. He was all smart, smoking a cigar, and he had one of those stripy duffel bags over his shoulder. He just kept staring at me. And so I said, "What are you looking at? Do you want a picture?" And he laughed and he walked off towards the Nook. And I went around every single night after that to see if I could see him again. I told my mother I was going to Mass. I didn't see him again for ages, Fu. That's what I found out his name was. I played skipping outside Brenda's house with all the kids in the street, just in case I saw him again, but then I gave up. I left school and got myself a job in the Gaumont Cinema in the Dingle. I had to walk up and down the aisles with a flashlight and count all the heads, and Brenda got a job in the cafe, the Central. We sort of lost touch for a while, you know, like you do. I hadn't seen her for ages, but then I met her one night at the Davy Lewis Theatre, and she told me, "Do you know that fella that I fancied?" And he'd been staring at me in the street. He'd called into her cafe.
My name is Mr. Fu. I was born in Shanghai. I came here in 1945, just after war. Chinese seamen were blasted off the Atlantic in merchant navy by Germans. It was terrible. So many of the Chinese sailors were torpedoed during the Atlantic run. I never know seafaring. It was not very good to me, like. It was very hard working, the sea, but at that time, what could you do, like? When I came to Liverpool, I lived in Niall Street. They call it the boarding house. The boarding house was owned by a Blue Funnel. We used to have a Davy Lewis here, but I don't think you would know because it was knocked down a long time ago. I used to go to the Central. We got vouchers of Blue Funnel. The company was called Alfred Holt Company. I came here because of my uncle. He worked for the Ocean Steamship Company and China Mutual. He came back to China one day and said to me that I could get a boat with him and send me money back home to my mother and my wife. I didn't want to go. What could I do? I travelled round the world to get here. I would have walked across China and swum across rivers to help me family. I arrived in London with nothing. I couldn't speak a word of English. My uncle gave me directions, he had gone on before me and told me, when I arrived at Lime Street Station, I had to make my way to meet a man called Mr. Smith. He will give me a job as a sailor. Oh, I looked very smart, I had a suit on. Very smart. I had a big cigar my uncle gave me, and a bit of money and a dress to go to. I told my wife, I said, what can I do? I don't want to go. But we lived on a farm, and we were starving. In those days, that was the time when the Japanese would come to the village and take what they want, and use a chopper on old people. She said, you have to go. If you don't, what will happen to us? We will die. So I went She was all right, my wife, We had only been married for 3 months. Not like now, not like here. You don't fall in love. It was arranged between the family. She was a friend of my mother's. She came from Ningpo, from a very poor family. There were lots of farmers in those days. We all worked on the farm from the age of 6. There was no education when we were growing up. My mother burnt my stomach so I could be identified if anybody came and took me. She needed me to work.
Well, I said to Brenda, go away. He's come back. And the next thing, I went down to the Central. I swapped my shift with another usherette, so she did the matinee, and I went and sat in the cafe for ages, and I got all dressed up. I used to dress like all the big stars in those days. And then he walked in. He came and sat on the same table as me, and he was dead friendly with Brenda, because she worked there, and she saw him all the time. And they were having a laugh, and all of a sudden he told me that Brenda had told him that I fancied him like mad. I could have killed her. She'd made a holy show of me. And he said to me, look over there. And I turned to look out of the window, and he kissed me on the cheek, and I said, hey, I don't even know you, get off. And he said, you've got a whole lifetime to get to know me. Before we knew it, we were going out. He told me he came from Shanghai, and it sounded lovely and romantic. Brenda was going with his mate, and we used to have a ball, and we always ended up in a nook. The landlady, Mrs. Jones, well, she wore these massive hats, I swear. I don't even know how she got through the door. All the sailors used to bring birds of paradise home for her and little monkeys, and she'd stuff them and stick them on a hat. Don't ask, it doesn't even bear thinking about. How did she even do that? She even had one of those hats in a glass case. She was made up with them. It must have got too heavy for her head. That was there for donkey's years. I wonder what happened to that. She used to sit on this high chair, and she had 3 sons. Now, Tim was a policeman. There was Gerald and Coleman, that's it. And she got all the customers. Everyone respected her. All the Chinese sailors drank in there. There was a Chinese club upstairs. In those days, there were 20,000 Chinese seamen in Liverpool. Oh, I'd be standing under the exit sign under the clock in work, watching Garbo on the silver screen, dreaming of Fu, dreaming about meeting him in that pub.
When the ship docked in Liverpool, the Chinese crew went into town with all their money and gambled like we play Pack-a-Pew or Mahjong. A lot of the seamen got benefits from the shipping company. They were paid to the owners of the boarding houses, and the sailors would get like pocket money. And that's all. We all just wait around, spending all of our time in Nelson Street playing games. We will gamble on 2 flies walking up a wall.
Fu fell madly in love with me, but I couldn't take him home because, well, there would have been murder, do you know what I mean? He wasn't a Catholic apart from anything, and I mean, you know, he was Chinese. I nearly died every time he came to meet me at the Gaumont, in case anyone saw us. He'd be standing outside, smoking his cigar, waiting for me, and when he'd see me, he'd pick me up by the waist and twirl me around. Oh, it was lovely. But I used to panic, because one of my aunties used to go to the pet shop up Park Road. She said she liked to talk to these lovely little Chinese girls. They'd take exotic birds in boxes to Lime Street Station and send them off all over the world. I knew if she saw me, that would be the end. Anyway, once me and Fu got to Chinatown, it was all right. Everyone was accepted there. And Fu was the centre of attention. And we'd walk past the Shanghai, Auntie Lou would be sitting on the steps talking to everyone, and all the kids would be playing in the street, waiting for their uncles to come out of the houses after playing the mahjong. If they won, all of the kids, it didn't matter who they were, they'd all get money and handbells that were massive. I swear, they were the size of a football or the size of a kid's head, and they'd get lychee nuts off Wu Fang. And Fu used to make all the kids scream. He'd show them the scars on his stomach, and he told them he was attacked by the Japs. He was such a liar. And he used to tell them stories about his trips to Australia, India, America, and then he'd go and buy bean sprouts off the old man who grew them in the cellar. Do you remember him? Oh, it was amazing in those days. Sometimes the Black Maria would come to Nelson Street, and all these Chinese men would come up from the basement in one of the gambling dens opposite the Blue Funnel office, laughing their heads off, and they'd all be pretending they couldn't speak a word of English. And one of the little kids, he'd always run up to Kent Gardens and shout, "The coppers are here!" And all the women had come running to watch. It was dead funny. They'd already been warned a few days earlier by this detective. It was like a film. There was never any trouble.
There were hardly any fights, like. If there were, they were only between Chinese, and even then, there was this Chinese fellow who lived in Pitt Street, and someone would run to his house, and he would turn up and stop the fight.
Women weren't allowed in the gambling houses, but one day, one of the women got so sick and tired of having no housekeeping. Do you know, as soon as her husband got off the ship, he went straight in and lost it all. He kept getting arrested, and she was fed up to the back teeth of getting him bailed out. So, this day, she walked in, and saw about 4 of them sitting at a table smoking, and she saw them playing the mahjong, banging the tiles around, making all this noise. You could even hear it in the street.
She stormed over to them and lifted up the whole table and took it across the room like,
Oh, she was dead nice, you know. Everyone was really shocked. But can you imagine having 5 kids and no money, and he expected a meal on the table and the kids to look nice? What was she supposed to do? There was no social in those days. Street angels, house devils, that's what some of these sailors were, and not just the Chinese either. All nice to everyone outside and then nasty indoors. There were loads of jobs around there. You could walk into one in the morning, get sacked, walk into another in the afternoon. Now I knew this woman who worked in the snuff factory. Patsy her name was. And she got mesmerised doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, and she fell into the vat of snuff. Now, her sister Nancy said they just picked her out. She lost her job, just like that. But she walked into another one the same day, all covered in snuff. These were hard-working women. People took in washing to get a few bob, and one woman used to scrub the iron stairs on the Far East on her hands and knees, and she even donkeyed them and everything. It was hard times for women, but they were proud. It was hard work, but a joy to go to the wash house and meet up with all your neighbours and have a laugh, and there was nothing nicer to watch a load of clean washing going out all tied up with a stocking.
We went deep sea, away for about 3 months at a time.
And when the ship came back, all of the women and the children would be standing at Gladstone Dock waiting for them and waving and shouting, and they'd have tins of boiled sweets and presents for everyone.
We would draw around the feet of all the kids in Chinatown and bring back shoes and slippers for them. And games like robots made out of metal that could walk.
You couldn't get anything like that in England.
We would bring back a couple of birds and take them to the pub for the landlady to put on a hat. Mrs. Jones would ring a bell and shout, "Sanmona, time," in Cantonese. I spoke Shanghainese, and so did all my friends. We were all from the same village, but we had different jobs on the ship. Some of them were cooks, fitters, greasers, firemen, and all that. The men who spoke Cantonese and the men who spoke Shanghainese did not mix. They could not understand each other, you know. I learned to read and write on board the ship. I was on the deck. I did all painting, cleaning, and had English-Chinese dictionary, and I taught myself to read and write. I'm very clever, like. This woman, like, her name was Kathleen. She was a friend of the girl in the cafe. She used to come and meet me off the ship. She wanted me to marry her. But, you know, like, I wasn't bothered because I was already married. But I couldn't tell her that. Every time the ship docked, there she was, like a bad penny.
Oh, he was such a flirt. He used to call me a bad penny, and I'd laugh my head off and I'd say, "Phoo, you're terrible," and pretend to be shocked.
So I just play along with her like. I was a #1 gaffer in Chinatown. I got the men to work. I went to the docks every morning, and by this time I could speak Cantonese, Mandarin, and Hakka as well. I had a camera memory. I could just look at something once and then I would remember it. On board the ship, if you didn't gamble, you just had to sleep when you weren't working. Every day was the same. Work 12 hours a day. 2 men would share a cabin. We had bunk beds. It was small. The toilet and that was down the corridor. It was all right, like. There was no doctor on board if you fell ill. You had to wait until you got to shore. The food was old. It was all frozen because we were away so long. All the ships were named after Greek classics and myths. I can name them all now. Achilles, Adrastus, Aeneas, Agamemnon, Agapenor, the Ajax, and all that. We saw the world, and people even poorer than we were. When we got back to Liverpool, we came to Gladstone Dock. Then we would all go down to Nelson Street, like. Sometimes there would be 200 men standing in the street.
The authorities didn't like them. They didn't like the way they kept together, and they said they tried to make life difficult. They used to split them up and made them report to the police station every day and raid the houses whenever they felt like.
We stayed in the boarding houses, one for the Shanghai men and one for the Cantonese. It was all right, like, like the boarding houses. We could cook and wash our clothes. We had bunks in each room, like that. One of my friends said there were 3 beds high in one he stayed at. But when the authorities came, they took one down and put one back again when they left.
And I heard that was illegal.
Some of the men were sick with the TB. And when all the blood came out, they went to hospital. Some of them we never saw again. I stayed in an Oxton home for seamen for a while when I had the TB. It was for Chinese. Alfred Holt make a Chinese atmosphere. Chinese food and stuff, who had been missionaries in China. In those days, sometime when we came back from long voyages, we would stay in the boarding houses and then sometimes go coasting.
Some of them would go round Europe coasting for a few weeks, while the rest of the crew would go to the lifeboat class in Nelson Street. Fu was friends with this fella who taught lifeboat skills. He was very popular.
Me and Kathleen got on very well, like. I started to even look forward to seeing her. She worked in the pictures. She got herself a part-time job in a nook. All of the seamen went in that pub. She was a hard worker. It was only a small pub, but everyone went there. Or the Queen's Bar, like, I never went to see the pictures, like. I just walked down to Dingle to meet her after work, when I was on shore. I wrote to my wife in China and said that I should go back to be with her, but she said no. She said my mother would starve and they would all die if I went back. So I had to stay here. Immigration was after me. They were after all of us. One fella I know used to tie himself to the bed and get his kids to sit on the bed when they knocked on the door, and he would go out of the window like a shot. When they left, he would climb back in. One of his kids, one of the half-castes, said the bed would move across the room towards the window and come to a stop against the chest of drawers. I wasn't going to do all that.
If you ask me, all the Chinese seamen are all heroes, but the government called them undesirable. Even the British women who married them lost their identity and they were classed as aliens. Now I think that's just terrible.
We deserve a medal from the British for fighting in the war and the Atlantic crossings and getting torpedoed. Not sent back like a piece of rubbish you would put in a bin. Like I couldn't stay here. Immigration was after everyone. Don't get me wrong, some men wanted to go home. I had to get married.
I had this feeling Fu was going to ask me to marry him. And I kept pushing it and telling him, everyone's getting married, you know.
My friend said to me that he would arrange a marriage for me. His landlady had a friend who would marry me. She had a face like the back of a bus, but she was all right. She had a good heart. Oh, she was fat though. I would not want to be recognized in the street with her. No, I said, I will marry Kathleen, eh? When I was sick in hospital, Kathleen came to see me every day and brought me food. I look forward to seeing her. I will never forget that. I was in hospital for a few months with the TB and then went back to the boarding house. I could not go to sea for a while, so I stayed in the boarding house. Brenda got married to one of my friends, and when she was at work and he was coasting, me and Kathleen would go and sit round in her house. She had this gramophone, and I used to play one song over and over again and tell Kathleen that I would take her to Shanghai and introduce her to me mother and me brother. Didn't mention me wife I'd tell her how beautiful the countryside is, and I promised her one day I would take her, build a house with a garden, and we would have children, one for her and one for me, and maybe a couple more. We would dance around, and laugh. We would tidy it all away for Brenda to come back, and I will go back to the boarding house, and Kathleen will go home. I would sit in a boarding house reading a book and smoking. Men would lie in their bunks waiting for a ship. Some were cooks, and they would cook
Oh, he was so lovely. He'd go back to the boarding house and I'd go home and I'd just dream of him. Oh, I've just remembered there was a young lad called Boy. That's what everyone called him, Boy. He was badly burnt on one of the ships and he died in that boarding house Fu stayed at. Everyone in the neighbourhood went to his funeral oh God, they didn't even know him. But that's what it was like in those days. His headstone is at the back of the Anfield Chinese section, you know. It says Boy on it.
I would walk into Nelson Street to see some friends and gamble for a bit. What else can you do? When we got a ship, we went away for 3 months and everything was all right. I sent me allotment back to me mother and me wife. Blue Funnel sorted that out for all of us. Most of us had wives, and that's why we joined up. Not to train as a sailor, just to have a better life. Very soon I had shares in 5 businesses. I was good at mahjong. One night I won a chip shop outright, but I couldn't take it off the family. I said, you stay there and give me it one day if I need it
I went home one night and they were waiting for me. My dad had his sleeves rolled up and my mum had been crying. And she stood in front of the fireplace crying. And I could see the back of her head reflecting in the mirror and he was going mad. What will the priest say? What will the neighbours say? You dirty little prostitute. I tried to ask him what I'd done or who'd said what, but he belted me right across the face. He picked up the poker and my mother flinched. He hit me right across me back near me waist. A metal bar, it was, right across me back. Chinese, that's the last time you come into this house. Get out. You're not taking anything with you now. Get out. That's what he said. And my mother just stood there in front of the mirror and wept, crossing herself like mad, and she wouldn't even look at me. I haven't spoken to her since. I tried to once, but she just blanked me in the street. Don't deny it, he said. You've been seen. You've brought shame on this family, a good Catholic family like us, and you're nothing but a tramp. He pushed me into the hall, past the statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and he was looking down at me, looking all sad, pointing to his bleeding heart and a tear rolling down his cheek. Past the vestibule, he threw me onto the street. Once a tramp, always a tramp, he said. People will laugh at you. I looked him straight in the face and said, like they call you dirty Irish behind your back. You're dead in my eyes. He was dead 6 months after that. Any road, I stayed in Brenda's that night and I couldn't stop crying. And Brenda said that she was going to go and get a hair fella to go around and hit me dad with a poker. Let's see how he liked it. But I didn't want to cause trouble. Brenda went round herself, banged on the door, but they didn't answer. She said everyone was looking at her. Women standing together with their arms folded in doorways and curtains twitching. Brenda went to meet Fu. I was black and blue, and it really hurt when I walked. She stood outside the Gaumont, but he didn't turn up like he said he would. I had nothing. I felt ashamed. And Brenda gave me some clothes, and even Mrs. Jones from the pub said that she'd look through her wardrobe and sort out some clothes for me, and I said, oh, it's all right, Queen. Can you imagine? I was hard up, but I wasn't mad, as if I was going to wear one of those hats. Everyone felt sorry for me because I had nothing. People from work gave me tea towels and a kettle. I actually had nothing. The shame. I had to pack the job in at the Gaumont so I didn't bump into anyone from my family or the neighbours or the people from St. Finbarr's. I knew they wouldn't want to be seen dead mixing with the likes of us. I went to church and I asked the priest for communion and he said no. He said I'd brought disgrace on my family and the church and not to go back there. What did I expect? Even the Chinese Catholics had to sit at the back of St. Peter's on a Sunday. I don't think they were even allowed near the front. Apparently, one of my aunties had seen Fu pick me up after work and saw me linking him in broad daylight. She followed me to Chinatown, found out I had a job in a pub. But it wasn't the auntie that I thought it would be either. She ended up being all right and marrying a Chinese herself. Loads of girls did in the end. They made excellent husbands. Fu had promised me that he wasn't going away until the week after. He said he'd buy me a ring while he was away and we'd be engaged properly then. And he said that we'd get married. And I went around to the boarding house, couldn't find him. I went round all the pubs. He hadn't turned up. I searched everywhere for him. I even made a holy show of myself. I stood down at Gladstone Dock and shouted, Fu! And I went to see Mr. Smith in the office. And he said he was sure Fu was all right. He must have decided to take a ship. And I waited and I waited for him. Without him, I felt like I just couldn't breathe.
I was in the boarding house. It was late, sometime after dark. We heard this banging on the door. They rounded us all up in the corridor. This time there was no Black Maria. No one was laughing. The detective who took a backhander for the gambling den raids was nowhere to be seen. Every one of us in the boarding house was taken down to the dock. Some of the men said they were married and had children, but that made no difference, you know. First, they took the ones who were troublemakers. Then they took the ones who had criminal record. Then they took the ones they said had BD, syphilis, gonorrhea. They were asking us where the opium was and pushing us all around. I didn't know what was going on. We went to the docks and they put us on a ship and took us down to the hold, and we waited. The ship, it was called the Sarpedon. We felt it move and then stop again. They took us to the west float through Albert Dock and anchored on the Sloin. We waited for 2 days. Then, more men came and joined us. They had heard rumours men were being rounded up, so they hid in the cellars. And when they thought the coast was clear, they came out of hiding. Special branch. They were doing intensive search to find them and to take them down to join us on the ship. They said they were rounded up off the streets, and some said the houses were raided, and their kids were asleep in the bed. I don't know how true it was, but that's what they say.
I still wanted to tell Fu about what happened with my dad, and I was worried he'd turn up at the Gormont and not be able to find me. I thought he might write a letter and send it to Brenda for me, and every day I ran to the front door and Brenda's to check, but nothing ever came. And then I started being sick with worry. But then I realised the reason I was being sick was more than worry. I was having Fu's baby. Brenda said other men had gone too, and Bessie Braddock was going mad, and a load of women had met in Nelson Street, and they were trying to find out where all their fellas had gone to. 300 British wives of Chinese seamen met on the Sunday and formed a defence association in Liverpool. Brenda said she read it in the Echo. They'd even sent a telegram to the Chinese ambassador appealing for intervention on their behalf. I know this might sound terrible, right? But wouldn't that make a really good film? 300 aliens in Chinatown? Sorry, my sense of humour's a bit dark at times. You've got to have a laugh, though. There was another meeting as well in the Engineers' Hall in Mount Pleasant. The Lord Mayor was there, and all the MPs. I've got this cut in here from the Echo. Marion Lee was the leader. It says 19th of August, 1946. During the war, the Chinese seamen were paid £17, 17 shillings per month, on which they were able to keep their families respectably. Recently, they were signed off at ports in the Far East, where new crews are being recruited at a wage of £7, 7 shillings a month. They didn't even get danger money, and yet the British wives of GIs got loads of assistance. I didn't go to the meeting though because I wasn't married to Fu and I felt a bit ashamed in case he just didn't want to know me anymore. I'd heard of women whose kids ended up in Fazakerley Cottage Hospital, and women who went away and never came back, and women who'd gone to the madhouse just because they were having a baby. I didn't want that. I wanted Fu. Brenda said she knew of this woman. She used to go into the Central and she'd given her some advice for me. She told Brenda I needed to go to the chemist and ask for Bob Martin's powders and to say it was for my dog and to mix that with loads of gin in a glass of, I don't know what that was, and something to do with a red hot poker. I wasn't quite sure if I was to drink the gin with the Bob Martins, get in the bath with the red hot poker, or put the poker in the drink. Anyway, I didn't like the sound of it, but I thought I'll just give it a try. I stood outside the chemist and Brenda went in, and she was in there for ages, and then she popped her head out of the door. Kathleen, she said, he wants to know what kind of a dog you've got. Any road, he wouldn't sell it to her. I just had to admit it. I was pregnant, and I was going to have Fu's baby, and when he came back, he would be made up, as our little family was already starting, and then we'd get married up in Mount Pleasant in the registry office with a do in the Far East afterwards. The Far East, Great George Street, was where all the best people went. And then I stopped kidding myself. After a while, I stopped pestering the postman and the usherettes in the Gormont and Mrs. Jones in the pub.
They took us to Hong Kong. Some men didn't even make the journey. One man jumped the ship, and when we shouted man overboard, they just ignored us. We heard rumours about difficulties entering Shanghai, and we couldn't go back, I heard the Chinese Seamen's Union and the Kuomintang and the Communists infiltrated union had all transferred to Hong Kong. The Kuomintang were very brutal against the Unionists. From 1930, there had been mass executions. We were in danger to go back to Shanghai. The staff of the Chinese Association of Labour in Chongqing had all been arrested. Workers who were politically active, they just disappear like. The Colonial Office gave orders to Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, if any Chinese sailors attempted to get back on board, do not let them.
So it was true. The woman who did the accounts in the Blue Funnel office told me he was already married in China. He only wanted to marry me to stay here. He'd been sending money back to China the whole time. I wish he'd told me though, because I would have helped him. To be honest, most of us knew that they were already married in China, but they were lovely. And they looked after the family, and they didn't drink or anything, and they didn't batter the wives. I knew of this woman, well, we all knew her. She sent her son to China to help her husband's Chinese wife and family out because they were starving. Well, I could have helped out like that. I moved to Faulkner Street and I lived on the ground floor. I had one room and a small scullery, and the toilet was in the yard, and it was freezing. I didn't have any curtains on the window, just an old sheet. I remember my bed was up against the wall, and it being a very, very small room, and I had a small chest of drawers, and I'd pulled the bottom drawer out for when the baby came. Do you know, I can't remember anything else about that room, except it was very, very cold. When the regulars in the Nook found out, they had a whip round, they bought me some lovely curtains and a matching bedspread and clothes for the baby, and one of the women in the house gave me her old pram. It was a silver cross. Alfie was born not long after. I won't go into details because it'll knock you sick. Alfie, after Alfred Holt, rest his soul. Without him, I'd have never met Fu. No matter what anyone said, I had a feeling deep in my heart, call it a premonition if you like. I knew he would not have left me without telling me.
I was worried about me Kathleen and kept singing that song. I take you home again, Kathleen. Just to keep me mind of what was happening like. One night, I managed to slip away. I got introduced to a friend of one of the sailors and paid a gangmaster to take me back to England. I was to pay off weekly out of my wages, and I could go back to Liverpool. It would take years to pay back, but I had the shares, and I could sell them to pay it off quicker. And I had that chip shop, I got the ring for Kathleen and wrote to my wife, and I told her I had fallen in love and explained to her it was a modern thing that people do in the UK.
Poor Brenda, she fell on hard times. I don't know what happened to her. Her fella had disappeared as well, and she started drinking. A lot of the time she wasn't happy. I suppose that she just did the best she could. She did the best that she was capable of, I suppose, whatever went on. And when Brenda had the baby girl, well, she would have been 11 months old or so when she was taken into care, and she was put in an orphanage somewhere in the Leeds area, and she was there for 18 months. She told me that she had to make a choice. It was either her, the little girl, or the little boy. Loads of kids were sent to orphanages all over the place, split up from the brothers and sisters. Some of them never saw their families again. Anyway, listen to this. You won't believe this. By sheer coincidence, I met another fella called Fu. I got myself a job working for a factory, but I could work from home making thingies, handbags. And I used to sit on the step and sew them up. He was introduced to me by the owner of the factory when Alfie was 1 year old, and he was all right. Fu too. That's what I called him. No relation to that other one. He said he wanted to marry me, so I said, all right, and we did. Nothing special. A little tea in St. Michael's Church Hall, after the registry office, not the original hall, because that one been blown to bits years earlier with the church and the entire area during the May Blitz. Futu was kind and good, and Alfie called him Papa. And when I got pregnant the second time, this time all official, Futu called Alfie number one son. He gave me money every single week for a treat to the cinema and to buy nice clothes. But he never once told me that he loved me. He used to say to me, "Keep your chin up," when people walked past and called me names. My own brother spat at me in the street and called me a whore and the C word. I could put up with the other swear words, but that for some reason really hurt, and his spit landed on Alfie. And Futu said, "Just keep walking, dear."
In 1947, I got a ship and made me way back to Liverpool and met the owner of a cafe. I was to work for him and he paid me. The cafe wasn't in Chinatown. I could not go out for 7 months because the master had said that immigration would get me and send me straight back. One night, I plucked up the courage, I popped my head out the door, and then I did that every night, and then I ran out to the end of the street and back, and I did this until I was brave enough to go around to the Nook. I was told Kathleen didn't work there anymore. And I went to the Gaumont, and I hung around for a while until someone came out and told me she had left ages ago. I heard she had a little boy, my number one son. I couldn't wait to see her to give her the ring.
Now, I don't like to talk about this, and don't repeat it to anyone. Fu did come back. When I found out where he was working, I took Alfie down to see him in his pram. And I parked him by the door. Dolly from the Bats in Cornwallis Street told me where he worked. I remember it clearly. I walked in, and the door was like here, and behind me. And then there was a long, narrow space at the side of the tables, and the counter was right at the far end. And I walked up to Fu, and he actually looked really pleased to see me. And I said to him, "Where have you been?" And he looked really surprised. "And you've been off to see your wife? Well, you didn't tell me about her, did you?" Fu came around to the front of the counter and he tried to put his arms around me, but I hit out at him. And he took off a ring that was on his middle finger and he said he bought it for me. Well, that won't buy me food, will it? I threw it right across the cafe and I got Alfie and I walked out. Oh, God, I nearly died. I never saw him again. That was when I decided to marry Futu. I went straight around to his chip shop and he was sitting there surrounded by those wooden lanterns he used to make, and he asked me to marry him. I remember it clearly. He just smiled. That was the closest he ever got to romance. Years later, when Alfie was about 5 years old, he came home from school and he said this man had been standing at the gates and he'd given him a box of chocolates and told him that he was his real father and that he was going to work on the Isle of Man boats. I told Alfie, "Don't take any notice." I told him he did have another dad, but he was dead, torpedoed in the Atlantic, and he believed me. Oh, he used to pray for his dead dad, and every time they sang that hymn in church for those of peril on the sea, he would cry his little cotton socks off. He had terrible bad dreams about it, like he was visualising his dad going down with the ship. Oh yeah, we could go to church by this time. Like I said, it was a different kettle of fish in Chinatown. We went to St. Vinny's and to St. Michael's, even though they were different religions, and they just accepted everyone. And even now it's like an institution, that place. Fu too adopted Alfie and treated him like his own.
I paid off my debt and decided I couldn't stay on shore. I'd been working for the Isle of Man boat for years. I got myself shares in a cafe in Great George Street. It was all right, somewhere to stay when I come back from sea. I moved around Liverpool with me chip shops, and I married the woman my old landlady suggested years earlier. She was all right, didn't bother me. I went out at 8 in the morning and got back at 12 at night. She didn't bother me like.
Life just went on. Alfie and baby Ella used to go to Sunday school, watch Chinese propaganda films, and every year there was a Chinese picnic organised by the Chi Tong, and we'd all go on the bus for the day out. Oh, we had a laugh. It was just fantastic.
I kept away from Kathleen. I knew when someone tries to pinch a girl, sometimes the knives come out.
In 1958, this fella, a photographer, came knocking on our door and asked us if we could take Alfie and Ella to his studio to be photographed to take partner film. I took them along and all the half-caste kids were there. Some were getting rejected for not looking Chinese enough, and one for not having really dark hair. I thought that was a bit sly. It was bad enough the full Chinese not accepting them for some photographer to rub it in. Any road, I got a letter off 20th Century Fox. Alfie and Ella got chosen to be in the film, The Inn of the Sixth Happiness. Hollywood were making it. It was about this missionary called Gladys Aylward. I'd never heard of her. I had to drop the kids off in Norton Street, sign a form when I handed them over, and that was that. I pretended they were going on holiday. I gave Alfie a box of Maltesers when he got on the coach, and he was still crying when they drove off. He told me years later he opened the box straight away and all the Maltesers rolled down the aisle, so he sat there crying, holding that empty box all the way to Wales. Oh, God love him. The pay was good. It was £12.50 a day for each kid. I did miss them at first. They were away for about 6 weeks, but after about a week I got used to it. They had a chaperone and I knew that they'd be all right. They went to North Wales, Bedgellet, and later on Alfie had to go to London for the close-ups because he was a star. He had like a baby on his back and he had a talking part, and he held that Ingrid Bergman's hand most of the time in the film. And who was that fella? They sellotaped his eyes to make him look Chinese. Robert Donat, that was it. Well, he was in it. Kurt Jurgens and Bear Kwok. So I had all this money and all this time on my hands, and I thought, I'm off. I went to America because I wanted something exciting to happen in my life as well. Good times, that's what I wanted, and laughs with people I like. I just packed a case and left. Never even said goodbye to Fu Tu or the kids. I just went. It was easy then. You only had to go down to the pierhead. I'd had enough. You have to put things in perspective. We had a hard time, women in those days knocking around with the Chinese. Even to this day, there's a bit of a stigma, isn't there? It might not seem as bad as it was years ago, but in those days it was hard. It's still prevalent in Liverpool. The Chinese are more placid. They don't like making a fuss. Other people are more outgoing and talk about it, aren't they? It was worse for my kids in a sense because they were in between us. They're not English. They're not Chinese. They're just stuck in the middle. Do you know what I mean? You're not one thing and you're not the other. In those days, if a woman was knocking around with a Chinese man, she was a whore. So it's not something that you really want to talk about. I've had a dog's life, and apart from that, my own family disowned me as well. Most of the women that was knocking around with Chinese, they was, excommunicated for want of a better word. I stayed a while in America, tried to get work in the movies. I must have been off my head thinking about that now. I liked money, but I didn't know how to make money. And even if I had some, I couldn't hold on to it. My mother used to say to me when I was a little girl, the streets are paved with gold, but you've got to know how to pick it up. I could pick it up all right, but it used to drop out my hands quicker than I could pick it up. Fu Tu said nothing to me when I came home. By then we were living in the tenements in Lydia Ann Street. It was as if I'd never even been away. Alfie kept on singing This Old Man over and over and over again. He'd learnt it in that film. Alfie and Ella were made up when they first saw me, but I don't think Fu ever forgave me. I took them for a walk down Nelson Street. Nothing had changed. I could see the oilcloths on the tables in the cellar. Do you remember that? Everyone went there. It was quite posh, the Shanghai, and you could see through a little hatch in the window. I was going to say I was sorry to them, but I forgot, and then it just seemed too late. Fu too bought a restaurant in Southport, and we moved out to Liverpool. He was very popular. We didn't have to ask for anything.
I stayed in Liverpool until the 1980s. And then the council came to me and said I had to leave Great George's Street and they were knocking me cafe down like that, and I had to move to St. John's Market. I wouldn't go. What could I do? I had to stay in Chinatown, like. In those days, the council destroyed Chinatown. They strangled it, building the council houses, and they pushed us all out. They sold the buildings for £1. People were dispersed all over Liverpool from Kent Gardens. They moved them to Skelmersdale, Netherley, Kirby, Norris Green, everywhere like. They should have kept it like the old Chinatown, you know. I went to Manchester. Council there were opening up empty warehouses for Chinese businesses. I came back to Chinatown, Liverpool, though, years later. My daughter and my son came from China, and I managed to go over and see my wife a couple of times, like. I go to St. John's Market and walk around for a while. I used to be able to go to Chinatown and bump into people, but now there is nowhere to go. I'm ashamed to even call it Chinatown. It's only half a street. In those days, no one thought about the future, about keeping a record. They thought about taking a casket and they would bury it and then it would be open in 100 years to give a picture. But it won't be a true picture. It will be all scattered. All the half-caste lads, the second generation, they have got nowhere to go to meet. I want to bring them all together one last time. I'm very old now. I'm just waiting to die like.
Alfie joined the Blueies for a while, but he didn't like her. Ella works for a TV company. They've got 5 kids between them. All of them got A stars, and they all went to university. I must admit, when they were young, I nearly died when they were doing the family trade school. It's just dragging up things that should be left in the past. It's easy to invite all those memories in your life, but so hard to let them lie. Oh, it's years ago now. There was this fella, Keith Coughlin. He was talking on the radio to that Roger Phillips. Do you remember him? He said he was researching into the forced repatriation of blue-funnelled Chinese seamen in Liverpool in 1946. Chinese sailors disappeared over 2 days. They were deported back to China. His own father had gone missing, and he knew someone called Lawrence Key who'd heard it happening when he was young, and he heard them screaming and shouting in the streets while they were getting taken away. There were people causing a commotion. They were shouting things like, "Hey, let go of him. He's married to Lily Emmett, and he's got 2 children. But they took no notice. They just shoved them in the O'Neill's vans. It was the London police. Liverpool police refused to do it. No one batted an eyelid. They just took it in the stride. Well, there'd been a war on, hadn't there? 2,600 men were forcibly deported over 2 days from Liverpool. I hope our Alfie never hears about it. Can you imagine wondering for the rest of your life if your father had been deported? Maybe I wasn't deserted after all.